We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf Beis and Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 22b. The Brisa says, Ilu Nemar Ozno Badelis. If the pasuk said Ozno Badelis, Hayisi Omer, so I would have said it means as follows. Yidkor Keneged Ozno Badelis. Delis in Ozno Lo, that he should pierce corresponding to where his ear is. They should pierce the door, and the door, yes, and not the ear. I would have thought the pasuk means to pierce the door corresponding to the placement of the Eved's ear. But the Gemara says v'yozen lo, but I would have thought not to pierce the ear. Is that even possible? V'achsib, but it's written in the pasuk. V'rotza adonov es ozno bar marsei. It says that his master is going to pierce his ear with the awl. So clearly you're piercing the ear. So I would have never thought not to pierce the ear at all. And so the Gemara clarifies, Ella, rather what it means is, if the pasuk had said Ozno Badelis, Hayisi Omer, I would have said it means as follows. Yirtze'ena la'ozen me'avroi, should pierce the ear from the outside, meaning pierce the ear not by a door. V'yanichena ladelis, then place the ear by the door. V'yidkor keneged Ozno Badelis, and then pierce, corresponding to where the ear is, pierce the door itself. Talmud lomar, so the pasuk says, Biozno uvadelis. It says Biozno uvadelis, and Hakeitzad, what does that mean? It means doker v'holach, it means he pierces and continues to pierce ad shemagia etzel delis, until he reaches the actual door, so you pierce through the ear until you reach the door. And the Gemara continues, Delis, it says the door, Shomea ani bein akura bein she'ena akura. When it says a door, I might think whether the door is detached, whether it's attached, makes no difference. Talmud lomer mezuzah, the pasuk also says mezuzah, meaning the door post. Ma mezuzah me'umah, just like the door post is upright. Af delis nami me'umah, so to the door has to be upright. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai hayadoresh es hamikra hazeh min chomer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he would darshan this pasuk like a decorative wreath. There are other translations of chomer as well. Man ishtana ozen mikol ivarim shebeguf. What is unique about the ear from all the limbs of the body? Why are we specifically piercing the ear? Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Ozen sheshama koli al Har Sinai b'shah shamarti ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim. The ear that heard my voice in Har Sinai at the time that I said that it is to me that b'nei Yisrael are slaves. V'lo avodim la'avodim, they're not servants to other servants. V'holach zeh v'kana adon li'atzmo, and this person went ahead and he acquired for himself a different master, so to speak, a master that's not HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So yirtza, so that ear, it should be pierced. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe hayadoresh as hamikra hazeh kimin chomer. And Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, he darshan this pasuk like a decorative wreath. Man ishtana delis umezuzah mikol kelim shebebayis. What is unique about the door and the doorpost from all the vessels in the house? Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, delis umezuzah shayu edim mitzrayim, the door and the doorpost which were witnesses in Mitzrayim. B'shah shapasachti al hamashkof v'al shtei hamezuzos. At the time that I skipped over the lintel and the two doorposts, v'amarti, and I said, ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim, that it is to me that b'nei Yisrael are avodim. V'lo avodim la'avodim, they're not avodim to other avodim. V'hotzeisim me'avdis l'cheirus, and I took them out from servitude to freedom. V'holach zeh v'kana adon li'atzmo, and this person comes along and he acquires for himself a master. Yirtze b'fneim, he should have his ear pierced in front of them, meaning in front of the door. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Eved Kenani nikna bekesef uv'shtaro v'chazok, and Eved Kenani is acquired with money or with a shtar, with a document, or with a chazaka, that's a kinyan chazaka, a kinyan by taking possession. V'kona es atzmo bekesef al yedei acherim, he can acquire himself with money through others, uv'shtar al yedei atzmo, with a document through himself. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. We will see Rashi in a moment. V'chachamim omrim, and the chachamim say, bekesef al yedei atzmo, when it comes to money, it's the money through himself. Uv'shtar al yedei acherim, and with a document, that's through others. Uvilvad sheyehei hakesef mishal acherim, as long as the money is coming from other people. And Rashi explains, V'kona es atzmo miyad rabo. Again, the Mishnah said that how does the Eved Kenani acquire himself? That means how does he acquire himself back from his master? How does he go free? Rabbi Meir said, B'kesef al yedei acherim. Rabbi Meir said, money through others means as follows. Sheyitnuhu l'rabo al menas sheyehezeh ben chorin. According to Rabbi Meir, other people have to give money to the master on the condition that that money is being given in order that this Eved goes free. Aval hu atzmo lo yekabel mehem. The point, according to Rabbi Meir, is that he himself cannot get the money from them to then free himself. V'afilu al menas she'ein l'rabo reshus bo. Even if he's receiving the money on the condition that the master has no reshus, has no authority over that money, meaning maybe you would say then it really is the Eved's money and he can free himself. Because Rabbi Meir holds ein kinyan le'Eved below rabo. There is is no kinyan for an Eved without his master, and that is the idea over here. The idea is according to Rabbi Meir, that's why others have to give the money. If the money goes to the Eved, it automatically belongs to the master, and the Eved cannot use it to go free. And then Rabbi Meir said, "Uvishtar al yedei atzmo." He said that a shtar through himself. What does that mean? She'ikavelenu. That means that he himself receives the shtar. Uvegamar mefarish lekula de Rabbi Meir v'Rabbanan. The Gemara will explain everything in terms of what Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanan are arguing about. Uvilvad sheyeh hakesef mishal acher. And finally, the Chachamim say that when it comes to the kesef, so the kesef has to come from others, meaning kesef al yedei atzmo. He can free himself with the money, but it comes from others. The Eved ein lo klum. The point is, again, an Eved can't own anything. If he finds something or if he gets a gift, it goes to his master. So therefore the Chachamim are saying, if he's trying to redeem himself with money, the money has to come from others to him. And they give him the money on the condition that the master has no rishus over the money. That's what the Chachamim say. That's how it is effective. And the Gemara says, "Min nolan." From where do we know that an Eved Kanani is acquired through kesef, shtar, and chazaka? T'chsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, "V'snachaltem osam levneichem acharechem l'reshes achuza." It's talking about Eved Kanani, and it says they're an inheritance to your children. Hikishon hakasev l'stei achuza. What's happening in this pasuk is it says l'reshes achuza. The pasuk is comparing an Eved Kanani to a stei achuza, to an ancestral field. Mas stei achuza nikna b'kesef b'shtar v'chazaka. Just like an ancestral field is acquired through kesef, shtar, and chazaka, in general, land is acquired through kesef, shtar, and chazaka, meaning to say through money, through document, and through taking possession. Af Eved Kanani nikna b'kesef b'shtar v'chazaka. So to an Eved Kanani is acquired with money, with a document, or through an act of taking possession. And the Gemara says, "Ima stei achuza chozeres l'baylim biyovel." Now, what do we find by stei achuza? We find that it returns to the original owner at Yovel. Af Eved Kanani chozer l'baylim biyovel. Will we say also by an Eved Kanani that returns, meaning to say the Eved Kanani goes free at Yovel? Is that really true? Talmud lomer, that's not true. The pasuk says, "Liolam b'hem tavodu." You work them forever, meaning to say an Eved Kanani is owned forever. The Eved Kanani does not go free at Yovel. And the Gemara continues, Tana was taught in a Braisa af bechalipin. A Kinyan chalipin also works. That's also effective when it comes to an Eved Kanani. And the Gemara says, V'tana didon, what about our Tana? What about the Mishnah? Why isn't chalipin listed in the Mishnah? And to that the Gemara says, Milsa delesa b'metaltalin katani. Our Mishnah is only listing kinyonim that don't apply by movable objects. Milsa deisa b'metaltalin lo katani. But types of kinyanim that apply to movable objects like chalipin, that's not listed in our Mishnah. But enochinami, according to our Mishnah, also a kinyan chalipin would be good. It's just not listed in the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues, Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says, Eved Kanani nikna b'meshicha. An Eved Kanani can also be acquired by pulling the Eved Kanani. Keitzad, how so? Takfo va'etzlo kano. Let's say he pulls him with strength towards himself. So he acquires him by moving him. That's a kinyan meshicha, a kinyan of pulling. However, karu va'etzlo. Let's say he calls the Eved Kanani and the Eved Kanani comes over to him. Lo kano. That is not going to be considered a good kinyan. That's not called a meshicha when it comes to an Eved Kanani. The Gemara will discuss that point. In any case, the Gemara says, Bishlam l'tana didan. Now I understand our Tana. Why doesn't our Tana list Meshicha, which Shmuel says is a good kinyan? Same reason we gave by Chalipin. Milsa de'isa b'metaltali lo katani. Things that apply to movable objects, that's not listed in our Mishnah. The less b'metaltali katani. It's only things that don't apply to movable objects. That's the only things that are listed in our Mishnah. And so we understand why Meshicha is not listed in our Mishnah. El-latana bara, but for the Braisa above, which mentioned Chalipin, so Nisni Meshicha, so why not also teach the case of Meshicha? Teach the kinyan of Meshicha. Once you're already listing Chalipin, which is something that applies to metaltalin, it should have listed Meshicha also. And the Gemara answers to that, Ki katani milsa de'isa bein b'mekarkoi, bein b'metaltali. The Braisa only lists things that apply to both karka and metaltalin. It has to apply to both land and movable property. That would be something like Chalipin, but Meshicha, but when it comes to the kinyan of Meshicha of pulling, the v'metaltali isa, that only applies to metaltalin, but mekarkoi lesa does not apply to karka, it doesn't apply to land, lo katani, so the Tan of the Braisa does not list the kinyan of Meshicha. And the Gemara quotes what we said above, Keitzad takfo va'etzlo kano. How so? How do you make a kinyan Meshicha? If he pulls him towards himself and he moves him in that fashion, that's a kinyan. Karu va'etzlo, but if he calls him and he comes to him, lo kano, that's not considered a kinyan. And the Gemara asks, V'karo lo, is that really the case, that calling over the Eved Kanani is not a kinyan Meshicha? Vatani, but we learned in a brisa this is specifically talking about animals. Keitzad b'Mesira, how do you have a kinyan of Mesira? Achaza b'talfa, let's say he grabs hold of his hoof, b'sar, of his hair, b'ukav shela, or the saddle, b'shalif sheleha, or he grabs the load that is on top of the animal, or beprumbia shebepia, he grabs the bit in her mouth, uvizug shebetzavar, or he grabs the bell around her neck. Kana, all of those are a good kinyan, that's called a kinyan of Mesira. And keitzad b'Meshicha, how do you make a kinyan Meshicha? Korei lo v'hiba, if he calls the animal and she comes to him, o sheikisha b'makel v'ratzel lefanav, or he hits her with a stick and she runs in front of him. Kevan sha'akra yad v'regel kana, once she lifts up her hand and her foot, once she moves on account of his calling the animal or on account of him hitting the animal, that's considered to be a kinyan. So we see that when it comes to animals, calling the animal is considered to be a Meshicha. Rashi says, keitzad b'Mesira, how do you do a kinyan Mesira? Gabe behema koi, this is by animals. The katani masnisin behema gasa niknas b'Mesira. It says over there that a large animal is nikna b'Mesira, with giving over. And so again, it's going through the different ways of being kona when it comes to Mesira and Meshicha. And in any case, we have a question over here in terms of calling over the animal, that is a kinyan. And yet, when it comes to calling over the Eved, that is not considered to be a kinyan. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Asi v'amri lo Rabbi Acha Omer, continuing this discussion about how the Meshicha works. Rabbi Asi says, and some people say Rabbi Acha says, Ad shetahalech lefanav melo kamasa. The animal has to walk in front of him the amount of kamasa, of the animal's actual height. In any case, again, you see that by the animal calling the animal over is considered to be a kinyan. And the Gemara says, Amri, the answer as follows, Behema adaita demora ozla. When it comes to an animal, the animal always moves with the knowledge of the owner. It's doing what the master says. But Eved, when it comes to an Eved, adaita denafshe kozl, the Eved moves on his own accord. Even if you call the Eved over, the Eved's considered to be independent, he has das, and therefore calling the Eved and the Eved coming on his own is not considered to be a kinyan. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravashi says, Eved Katan, if you have an Eved that's a minor, Kebehei Madami, that's the same as an animal, because an Eved that's a minor is not moving on his own accord, he's doing whatever he's told, and therefore that would be considered a kinyan Mashiach if you tell him to come, and he comes over. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Keitzad b'chazaka, how does it work that you make a kinyan on an Eved Kanani with a chazaka, with taking possession? Hiter lo minalo, let's say he takes off his shoe for him, or holich kelav achrav lebeis hamerchat, so let's say the Eved takes his kalim after him to the bathhouse. Hifshito, he helps him undress. Hirchitzo, he helps him bathe. Sacho, he anoints him. Gardo, he scrapes his skin. Hilbisho, he puts clothing on him. Hinilo, he puts his shoes on him. Higbio, or he lifts him up. Kano, that's considered to be a kinyan. All of these cases are examples of kinyan chazaka. And the point over here is that all these different ways of serving the master, that's considered to be a kinyan chazaka, putting on the clothes, taking off the clothes, putting on the oil, scraping off the oil, etc. Amar Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon says, Lote chazaka gedola me hagba. The chazaka should not be greater than hagba, than lifting up. Shagba kona b'chol makom, because hagba, lifting up, is a kinyan in all situations. And the Gemara says, "My Amar, what exactly is Rabbi Shimon saying over here? What does he mean?" Amar Ravashi says as follows: Higbiuhu l'rabo kanu. Let's say he lifts up his master. That's a kinyan. That's like a kinyan chazaka. He's serving the master. Higbio rabo lo kanu. But if the master lifts up the eved, that's not a kinyan. That's what the Tanakama was saying, and that's what Rabbi Shimon is responding to. Amar Rabbi Shimon says, "Lo te chazaka gadola me hagba." Chazaka should not be a greater kinyan than a hagba. Shagba kona b'chol makom, because hagba is kona everywhere, meaning to say, according to Rabbi Shimon, if the master lifts up the eved, that also should be a good kinyan. That's called a kinyan hagba. But the Gemara says, Hashta di'amrit higbiuhu l'rabo kana. But now that you're saying that if the eved lifts up his master, that's considered a kinyan. Elameata, but according to that, shivcha kananis, if you have a shivcha kananis, tikna bebia, so she should be acquired through an act of relations, because she's essentially lifting up the master when they're having relations. And the Gemara says, no, kiko amrinon zenenev zemitzdar. When do we say that lifting up is considered a kinyan? That's if this one is benefiting, the master is benefiting, and the other one's in pain, meaning it's a kind of a service. But over here, when you're talking about a shifcha having bia, zenenev zenenehu, this is a situation where they're both deriving pleasure, and that would not be a kinyan hagba. But the Gemara continues, Shalo kedarka ma'ikal lamemar. If it's an act of bia that's shalo kedarka, where presumably she's not deriving pleasure, so in that case, what are you going to say? Is that going to be a kinyan hagba? And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Acha bar Ada de Minacha, Rav Acha bar Ada from Acha says, Man lei malon de lav hanois luhu letarvayu, who says that they don't both derive pleasure from such an act of bia. V'yod, and further, mishkavei isha ksiv, it says mishkavei isha, it says it in the plural, and the point is, hikisha akasav kedarka l'shalo kedarka. The pasuk compares an act of relations that's a normal act of relations to an act of relations that's not a normal act of relations, and therefore, since the two are compared, they're going to have the same halacha. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yehuda Hindua ger she'en lo yorshin hava. Rabbi Yehuda Hindua, that means to say he was from Ethiopia, he was a convert, and he had no one to inherit him. Chalash, and he got sick. All Mar Zutra l'shiyulei bei. Mar Zutra went to visit him. Chazia de takef le'al matuva. He saw that he was very sick. He was about to die. Amar leili avde, so he said to his servant, meaning he said to the servant of Rav Yehuda Handua, he said to him, Shlofli misani, take off my shoes, serve me v'amtinu lebesa, and bring it to the house, meaning to say he did not want to leave the Eved even for one moment, that the Eved would not have a master. And so therefore he said, right as Rav Yehuda Handua was about to die, he said, serve me, and that way I'll take possession of you. And the Gemara says, Ika diamri, there are those that say, Godel have it, that the Eved we're talking about here was an adult. And Rashi says, Shalofli Misanai, remove my shoes, Liknoso bechazaka hayemiskavin. He wanted to acquire him, Mar Zutra wanted to acquire the Eved with a kinyan chazaka, Sheyehei bavodaso kashiyamas adono. This way he'd be serving him when his master would die, when Rav Yehuda Handua would die. Iko diamri gadol haya. Some say the Eved was a gadol ha'Eved. V'nizar bo shalo yizko atzman ha'hefker. The point over here was, if he would be free for one moment at the death of his master, he would acquire himself from hefker, he would go free. He wanted to make sure that the Eved wouldn't go free. Lafikach kadem lefnei misa v'zachabo. Therefore, right before the moment of death, he took possession of him. V'hager perish lemiso, Mar Zutra perish l'chaim tachtav, shelo yehei ha'Eved below adon rega echad. The idea would be that the ger, the convert, he would die, and Mar Zutra would take over immediately. The Eved should not be without a master even for one moment. And we'll take a look at an earlier Rashi as well for a general point. Rashi points out, V'chol ovdei kochavim kekananim. When it comes to all idol worshippers, all non-Jews, they all have the status of Eved Kanani, even though we call it an Eved Kanani. It doesn't have to actually be that the Eved's from Canaan. Misha nimkar le'Eved, once they're sold as an Eved, they're considered the same as an Eved Kanani. Ela shekol avodim nikroin al shem Canaan. It's just that all avodim are called after the land of Canaan, mishum dechsiv bei, because it says by Canaan, Eved avodim, by the person Canaan, it uses this term Eved avodim, and so we refer to every Eved as an Eved Kanani, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph.